Eleanor Vane sealed the letter before she let herself read it back, because reading it back was how the last 40 had ended in the fire instead of the box. The wax took her mother's old thimble for a stamp, a dented oval pressed into red until it cooled, and she set the page on top of the others and closed the lid. Wrendale was quiet at that hour, in the particular way of a house built for 100 people and inhabited most nights by 12. Candle smoke and beeswax, and underneath the mineral cold of stone that no fire ever fully answered. She had grown almost fond of that cold. It asked nothing of her, which was more than she could say for most of what lived in this house. Below her window the gatehouse lantern came on, a small orange coin in the dark, lit every dusk without fail by a man named Tam, who had lit it, by his own account, since before the old Duke's coffin went down the drive. She watched it catch. Then she opened a drawer, took out a fresh sheet, dated it at the top in her small exact hand, and began again, because 2 years of practice had taught her that the second letter of the night was always the truer one. "My lord," she wrote, and stopped and looked at the 2 words for a long moment, the way she looked at a column that would not balance. The door opened without a knock, which meant it was Nell. "You'll go blind at that desk before he ever notices you're in the house," Nell said, setting down a tray with more force than tea required. "There's a fire built up not 4 rooms from here, with your name on the chair beside it, and here you sit, counting candle wax like it's coin. I like this room. You like this room, because nobody comes in it." Nell nodded at the box. "That's near full again." "It's my box. It's your 3rd box." Nell poured without being asked, which was its own kind of loyalty. "Your father taught you to keep accounts, my lady, not confessions. I don't know what you're balancing in there, but I'll wager it doesn't come out even." Eleanor did not answer that, because it was true, and because some truths were better left to warm on the hearth than to be picked up and turned over in company. She had been Duchess of Wrendale for 3 years and 4 months, and in that time she had written the Duke of Wrendale, by her own rough count, upward of 200 letters, and sent him none of them, and dined across from him some 600 times, and heard him say her Christian name, perhaps a dozen. He was not unkind. That was the strange furniture of it. He was correct, and considerate in the way a well-run house is considerate. Warm water and clean linen, and never once a raised voice, and beneath all of it something shut so carefully that she had stopped, in the 2nd year, trying to find the latch. "Your father used to say a column that balances is the only thing in this world that won't lie to you," Nell said, not quite looking at her. "I never thought you'd marry a man you had to keep accounts on just to know his temper. I don't keep accounts on him." Nell looked at the box. "I keep the weather," Eleanor said, and that made Nell laugh despite herself. A short bark of a thing, and the sound of it was the only warm noise in the room until a boy from the stables knocked to say a rider had come up from the London road with word that Mr. Gerald Ashworth would be arriving within the week, and would the household please have the blue rooms opened. Nell's face did the thing it always did at that name, a small settling, like a cat deciding whether a sound in the yard was worth its attention. "Again," she said. Again Eleanor agreed, and looked once more at the 2 words on the fresh page, my lord, and did not finish them that night, and did not know yet that the box on her desk, and every dated page inside it, would not stay hers to keep secret much longer than the season now beginning to turn outside her window. She had come to Wrendale in the back half of a summer 3 years gone, in a hired chaise that smelled of dust and her father's fading cologne, up a drive lined with horse chestnuts just past their candle blossom, and she remembered thinking, with the flat clarity of shock, that a house so large ought to have made more noise-settling than it did. Her father had ridden the first mile with her and no further, because his eyes by then had gone bad enough that the physician forbade it, and because, she suspected now, he could not have borne watching the gates close behind her. He had held both her hands in the yard at Thorn Cottage, and said only that the debt was settled, and that she was not to think of it as a sale, though everyone in the county would think of it as exactly that, a solicitor's letter and a duke's ring exchanged for a sum too large for a bookkeeper's daughter to have found any other way to answer. She had not loved Julian Ashford. She had not, in truth, known him, beyond one brief and formal introduction at an assembly the winter before, when he had watched her keep her father's accounts at a side table for the better part of an hour, and said almost nothing at all. He was waiting for her in the hall the day she arrived, correct in dark blue, his mother a pace behind him, with an expression Eleanor would spend a year learning to read as merely cautious rather than cruel. He had bowed over her hand and said he hoped she would find the house comfortable, and she had said she was certain she would, and that had very nearly been the whole of their courtship, condensed and delivered in under a minute, with the rest of a marriage to be built, apparently, out of whatever scraps a man was willing to leave lying about. She learned him the way she had learned her father's ledgers, by watching what recurred. He touched 2 fingers to the inside of his left wrist when the talk turned to his father, always the same brief press, gone before anyone else seemed to notice it. He took his tea without sugar, and remembered, without being told twice, that she took hers with a very particular amount of milk. He read at night behind a closed door, and did not invite her in, and did not, so far as she had ever determined, entertain anyone else behind it either. It was Fenner, the land steward, whose eyes had begun to fail him that autumn over the smaller figures, who gave her the opening. She found him in the estate office, squinting at a column of rents by candlelight, muttering the numbers half aloud, and without quite deciding till she took the page from his hand and read the total back to him correctly on the first pass. "Well," Fenner said, looking at her properly for what she suspected was the first time in 3 years. "Well now, that evening at dinner, with the dowager occupied in a low argument with the housekeeper about the blue rooms, Julian set down his glass and asked, without any particular ceremony, whether she would be willing to take a hand in the estate accounts until Fenner's sight improved. It was the longest unbroken sentence he had spoken to her in a month. "I would," she said. "I keep good accounts." "I know," he said. "I have known it a long time." And then, as though he had said more than he intended, he looked back down at his plate, and the subject closed as neatly as a ledger drawer, and she sat turning that one sentence over for the rest of the meal, wondering what a man meant by a long time when he had known her, by any ordinary measure, for less than 4 years. That was where the door first opened a crack. She would remember it later as the beginning, though at the time it felt like nothing at all. Only a small kindness in a house that measured its kindnesses in teaspoons. Gerald Ashworth arrived 8 days later in a curricle that had clearly cost more than the horses pulling it, and brought with him a manner so polished it took Eleanor the length of the first dinner to notice how carefully it had been made. He was handsome in the way of a portrait rather than a person, everything in proportion, his smile arriving a half-breath behind his eyes as though it had further to travel than most men's. He kissed her hand and called her cousin before she had given him leave, and remarked over the soup that he had heard the new Duchess kept the household books herself now. How very economical. How very like a family that had always known the value of a shilling. "My father taught me," Eleanor said. He used to say a column that balances is the only thing in this world that won't lie to you. How practical, Gerald said. Though I find most families prefer their women decorative rather than accurate. It so rarely occurs to anyone that a woman might be both. He smiled the half-second late smile again. You must forgive me, cousin. I've spent too long among men who lie beautifully and add badly. It's refreshing to meet the reverse. Julian's jaw did not move, but Eleanor, 3 years into learning his weather, saw something pass behind his eyes and settle. Cold and precise, the way frost settles on a window without ever seeming to arrive. Captain Thomas Merritt, seated at Eleanor's left, leaned in under cover of the second course. Don't mind him, he said, low. Gerald insults people the way other men compliment them, out of habit, and mostly without malice. He said it kindly, an old friend's ease in his voice, the same ease he had shown her 3 winters before, when he had walked her twice round an assembly room and asked, half in jest, whether a captain's pay might one day compete with a bookkeeper's daughter's good sense. She had liked him then. She liked him now, in the plain, uncomplicated way one likes a door that has always opened easily. And if it isn't habit, she asked. Merritt considered that with more seriousness than the question strictly required. Then I'd watch which pocket he keeps his hands in, he said, because a man like that only troubles to charm a room when he wants something out of it that the room hasn't offered yet. She thought of that later that night, alone in the estate office with the ledgers spread before her and the gatehouse lantern burning steady in the dark beyond the glass, and found she could not put it down. She found Julian in the same room past 11, which had not happened before. He stood at the window with his back to the door, and she noted before he heard her that his hand was pressed to the inside of his own wrist, the old unconscious gesture, though nothing in the conversation at dinner had touched on his father at all. I didn't think anyone else kept these hours, he said, without turning. I like this room. So Nell tells me. A small, dry note in it, almost a joke, rationed out so carefully she nearly missed it. He turned. You made a good answer to Gerald tonight. It was my father's answer. I only borrowed it. It suited you better than it would have suited him. He looked, for a moment, as though he meant to say something further, and did not. Why did you marry me, if I may ask it so plainly? I never did ask you. It was the first time in 3 years he had asked her anything of the kind, and she answered it as plainly as it was given. Because my father would have lost everything otherwise, and because you asked, and no one else had. That's an accountant's answer. It's a true one. She held his gaze, which she rarely allowed herself. Why did you ask? For a moment she thought he would answer her. His mouth opened on the shape of a word. Then a servant knocked to say Mr. Ashworth wished a word before he retired, on a matter of the eastern boundary hedge, and whatever Julian had been on the point of saying, folded itself back into the same locked drawer everything else of his lived in. And he excused himself with a small bow, and left her standing in the cold room, with the lantern still burning outside the glass, and the sense, entirely new to her, that there had been an answer, and that she had come within a single interruption of hearing it. She agreed, 3 days later, to take the Eastern ledgers in hand herself, the old ones, back to her father's original debt, at Fenner's suggestion that a fresh eye might catch what his failing one no longer could. She did not yet know what she was agreeing to disturb. She only knew that the Columns, unlike the man she had married, had never once refused to answer her honestly, and she went to them the way she had always gone to numbers when the rest of the world grew too quiet to trust, certain that somewhere in all that patient arithmetic there was a truth waiting, and no notion at all of how far that truth would reach, or how many people it would fall on before it finished falling. The eastern ledgers went back further than she expected, bound in cracked calf and smelling of the tallow that had lit the room they were first written in. And she spent 3 mornings simply learning the hand of whichever clerk had kept them, before Fenner took the post himself. It was slow, careful work, the kind she had always found restful, and she moved through the decades the way one moves through a house, room by room, until she reached the year of her father's ruin, and the pace of everything in her went very still. The entry recording the original debt sat on the page in a hand that did not match a single line above or below it, where the surrounding figures were cramped, economical, written by someone who had learned to make ink last. This one line ran generous and loose, the pen barely lifted, the sum itself carrying a flourish under the final numeral that appeared nowhere else in 40 pages either side of it. Mr. Fenner, she said, when she found him in the yard the next morning, checking a cartwheel. Who kept the Eastern accounts the year my father's debt was entered? Fenner did not look up from the wheel for a long moment, longer than the question warranted. I did, he said. Same as always. Then why does that one line not look like your hand? He straightened slowly, the way an old man straightens when his knees have opinions about it, and looked at her with something she had not seen in his face before, not surprise, but a kind of tired relief, as though a weight he had been asked to carry a long while had just shifted to a second pair of shoulders. Because it isn't, he said. A thing that's gone asks nothing of you, my lady. It's done, it's buried, you walk on over it, and the ground holds. But a thing that's only buried waits. It has all the patience in the world, and it doesn't care how long you make it wait, because it isn't going anywhere until somebody digs. Mr. Fenner, I'm an old man who's kept this family's numbers for 36 years, he said, and I've learned that a steward's first duty is to the truth of a column, and his second duty is to know when telling it will do more harm than good. I've been waiting a long while to be asked the right question by someone I trusted to hear the answer. He looked at her a moment longer. You'd best come to the strong-box room. Not today. Give me a day to be sure of my own nerve. She did not sleep well that night, and wrote no letter at all, only sat at the desk with the box of unsent pages beside her, and the gatehouse lantern burning its small, steady orange in the dark, and felt, for the first time since she had come to Wrendale, that the ground under the house had gone thin as ice over a pond, and that something large was moving beneath it. She met Gerald in the walled garden the following afternoon, by what he called chance, and she was fairly sure was nothing of the kind. He was examining the espaliered pears with the air of a man pricing them. You've taken quite an interest in the old accounts, he said. Fenner mentioned it. He worries you'll strain your eyes. I find I have a good eye for a mismatched hand. Something in him went very still, and very pleasant at once, the stillness of a man arranging his face before his voice arrives to match it. Family papers are tedious things, cousin, full of clerks' errors and crossed entries. I'd hate to see you lose sleep over a smudged column when there's a whole house here for you to enjoy. I don't lose sleep over smudges, only over sums that don't add to what they claim. How very like your father, Gerald said, and smiled the smile that arrived a half-second behind his eyes. He was known for that too once, before it cost him rather more than he could spare. He picked a pear that was not yet ripe, and turned it once in his hand before setting it back on the branch, gently, as though it mattered to him that it not bruise. Some debts are best left where they lie, my lady. Digging up old ground rarely improves the crop standing on it. I say that as a friend to this family. All of it. My father is this family too, in his way, she said. He paid a debt that ruined him for a decade. I think I've earned the right to know precisely what it was he paid for. Gerald's eyes, for one unguarded instant, held something that was not charm at all, something closer to calculation, running very fast behind a closing door. Then the smile came back, entire and unbothered. "Ask Fenner, then," he said. "Old men do love to be asked things. It reminds them they're still of use." He bowed, unhurried, and left her among the pears with the distinct sense that she had just been warned, courteously, by a man who did not yet believe she would find anything worth the warning. She went to Fenner that same evening. He led her down to the strong-box room off the estate office by a single candle, his hand not quite steady on the key, and drew out from beneath a false bottom of ordinary correspondence a single folded document, older and plainer than the ledger page above it had suggested, sealed with a wax long gone brittle, and cracked along one edge as though it had been opened once, read, and folded shut again by careful hands. "The true bond," Fenner said, "your father's actual debt, in his own signature, and mine as witness, for a sum I'd guess is not a third of what that ledger claims he owed. I kept it back the day I saw the false one entered over it, because I didn't yet know whose hand had done the entering, and a man in my position learns to hold his tongue until he's certain which master he'd be betraying by using it. Eleanor unfolded it with hands that did not feel entirely her own, and read the sum twice to be sure of it, and found that Fenner was right, and that her father's ruin had been built on a figure roughly a third true and 2/3 invention. Who paid the false sum, she said, though some part of her already knew the shape the answer would take, the way one knows the shape of a room before the candle reaches its corners. Who settled it, in the end? It was settled. My father told me it was settled, before I ever came here. His Grace paid it, Fenner said. The whole false sum, out of his own funds, within a month of his father's death, before ever a word of marriage was spoken between the two houses. I drew the papers myself. He never told your father where the money came from, only that the matter was closed. And he made me swear the same silence, and I've kept it 3 years for want of anyone with the standing or the nerve to ask me the right question. He looked at her, and something in his old face gentled. He'd seen you once, my lady, at an assembly, keeping your father's books at a side table while the rest of the room danced. He came home talking of nothing else for a fortnight, though he'd have cut his own tongue out before saying so to anyone living. When the false debt came to light and I brought it to him, he didn't hesitate above an hour. He paid it, and he never once asked what it might buy him, and when the marriage was proposed afterward it came from your father's gratitude and the family's convenience, not from any bargain his Grace ever struck for it. I don't believe he expected it at all. I don't believe he'd ever have asked. She sat with the true bond open on her knees, and the false ledger's memory burning behind her eyes, and felt the whole architecture of her marriage rearrange itself around her without warning. 3 years of careful correctness and locked doors resolving, all at once, into the shape of a man who had loved her before he had any right to, and had spent every day since paying for it in silence, rather than once let her think herself an object of pity instead of choice. She thought of the 2 words she had never finished on 100 pages upstairs. My lord. She thought she might finally know what came after them. She did not get the chance to say so that night. She was halfway across the hall to find him, the true bond still in her hand, when Gerald came through the front door at a pace no visit to the stables required, his coat dusted with road grit, and stopped at the sight of the paper before he had even finished crossing the threshold. And she watched his face do the thing faces do when a man realizes, a half-second too late, that he has already given something away simply by looking. "Where did you get that?" he said, and there was no charm left in it at all. Julian's voice came from the study doorway, quiet and even. "Eleanor, what is that?" "The truth of my father's debt," she said, and heard her own voice come out steadier than she felt. "And of who paid it, and why?" The silence that followed had weight to it, the particular silence of a house holding its breath. Gerald recovered first, and when he spoke again, the charm was back in place like a coat shrugged on against a draught, though it did not sit quite right on him now, not to her eye. "This is a family matter," he said, "not one for the servants' hall to discuss in the corridor. If you found some old scrap of Fenner's, I'd advise caution before waving it about. Documents can be misread, signatures forged. It would be a shame for anyone to be accused of tampering with estate records on the strength of an afternoon's confused reading." He let that sit a moment, precise as a blade laid flat on a table rather than raised. "I intend to bring the matter of the eastern boundary before Mr. Whitlow the magistrate within the week regardless, as it happens, on quite another point of law concerning the old Vane holding. It would go rather better for everyone, cousin, if this house were not also embroiled in accusations it cannot prove." He bowed, correct to the last degree, and went up the stairs without waiting for an answer, and Eleanor stood in the hall with the true bond still trembling faintly in her hand, and watched Julian's face close over like water over a dropped stone, and understood, with a dread that arrived colder than any of the numbers ever had, that the truth she had spent 3 days uncovering had arrived exactly 1 day too late to be told quietly. The Dowager came to Eleanor's rooms the following morning before Eleanor had finished dressing, which alone told her how serious the household considered the matter. Lady Augusta Ashworth had never once, in 3 years, entered that room uninvited. "You will forgive me for speaking plainly," the Dowager said, seating herself without being asked, which was, Eleanor had learned, the surest sign of trouble in the whole of her repertoire. "Gerald means to make this ugly if it is not settled quickly and quietly. A word to Mr. Whitlow, a suggestion of forged papers, your father's name dragged through an assize court at his age and with his eyes as they are. I am prepared to see you comfortably settled elsewhere for a time, with an allowance sufficient to want for nothing, until the family can resolve this in its own way. You are offering to pay me to leave. I am offering you peace," the Dowager said, "which is not nothing, whatever your father's ledgers taught you to think of it." Eleanor set down her hairbrush with great care, because her hands wanted very badly to do something less composed. "My father used to say a column that balances is the only thing in this world that won't lie to you," she said. "I have spent 3 years in a house that preferred its silences comfortable to its truths accurate, and I find I would rather every page of this be read aloud in front of the whole county than live behind one more kindly meant lie. I won't be paid to disappear, madam, not even by you." The Dowager studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes that might, in a less guarded woman, have been the beginning of respect. She said nothing further, only rose and left the room, and it was Julian himself who came an hour later, dressed for riding. His face arranged into the particular stillness she had learned meant he was frightened, and did not intend to show it. "You should go to your father's house," he said, without preamble, "until this is settled. Whitlow is a fair man but a slow one, and Gerald will make what noise he can while the matter hangs. I don't want you in the middle of it. I am already in the middle of it. I found the bond. Which is precisely why I want you out of his reach until I've dealt with him properly. His hand went, briefly, to the inside of his wrist, and away again. Eleanor, I am asking you to go, for your own sake. She heard, in that single sentence, 3 years of locked doors and unanswered questions, and a proposal she had never been given a chance to accept properly in the first place, and she heard it, in that moment, as exactly what it was not, a man closing a door on her the instant the truth of his own heart had come near enough to touch. She did not ask him why he had paid the debt, or why he had never told her, or what he had meant to say the night the servant interrupted him at the window. She only nodded once, and went to pack a single trunk, and by the time the carriage brought round she had left, in her haste and her hurt both, the rosewood box on her writing desk, exactly where it always sat, 3 years and 200 unsent letters deep, and did not think of it again until she was 2 hours down the road, and the storm that had been building all afternoon finally broke over the chaise in earnest, and the gatehouse lantern behind her. She was almost certain, though she did not look back to be sure, had gone dark in the wind. He found the box 4 days later, looking for nothing more than a shawl she might have left behind, that his mother thought should be sent on. He knew the hand on the topmost page before he had properly opened the lid, because he had spent 3 years watching her write columns in that same small exact script, and he stood a long while with the box in his hands before he let himself sit down at her desk and begin. The first letter was dated the autumn of her arrival. "My lord," it began, and then, in a hand grown slightly less careful with the effort of honesty, went on to say that she did not know yet whether she would ever send this, and that she had watched him at dinner touch his wrist when his father's name came up, and wondered what old hurt that was standing guard over, and hoped that whatever it was, he would not have to stand guard over it alone forever. He read on. The letters were dated across 3 years, one every few weeks at first, and then, in the last year, nearly every few days, and they charted a woman falling in love with a silence and refusing, letter after letter, to blame him for it, refusing even to blame herself, only setting down, with the same patient exactness she brought to a ledger, the small evidence of a marriage she had decided to keep faith with regardless of what it gave her back. There was a letter about the chestnut trees blooming the second spring. There was a letter, dated the night Fenner first asked her to take the Eastern accounts, that said only, "I think you may have just given me the first true thing I've owned since I came here. And thank you," though she had never once said it aloud. There was a letter dated 3 nights before she left, unfinished, my lord, and nothing after it, the very page she had set down the evening Nell brought the tea. He sat a long time with that page in his hand, in the room where she had written it, with the storm long since blown out, and a clean rinsed morning coming up grey and gold through the glass, and understood, with the particular vertigo of a man discovering the shape of a house he thought he knew, that every silence he had kept to protect her from thinking herself pitied had cost her 3 years of believing herself, quietly and without complaint, unloved. He rode for Thorn Cottage within the hour, and it was Thomas Merritt, arriving at the cottage gate not an hour behind him on quite the same errand, who found her first in her father's small parlour among the account books she had grown up keeping, and told her plainly, in the manner of a man who had once wanted her himself, and had long since made his peace with it, that whatever quarrel had sent her from Wrendale, Gerald Ashworth had just summoned the whole family, and Mr. Whitlow the magistrate to the house for the following noon to settle the boundary claim once and for all, and that if she meant to have any say in how her father's name came out of it, she had better ride back with him now, rather than wait for an invitation that might not come. "And his Grace?" she asked. "Is already there," Merritt said, looking, if I may say so, like a man who has finally understood something a great deal too late and means to spend the rest of his life making up the difference. "I'd let him try if I were you, for whatever my opinion's worth from a man who once hoped to be asked himself." She looked at him a long moment, grateful in a way that had nothing to do with what he had once wanted, and everything to do with what he was choosing now, freely, to hand her instead. "It's worth a great deal," she said. "You've never once made me feel it cost you anything to be kind." "It cost me nothing," he said, "to admire a woman who was always going to choose someone else. The trick is not minding it. I find I mind it rather less every year." He held the door for her, and did not say anything further about it, and she took that too, as its own kind of noble thing, freely given and asking nothing back. The long room at Wrendale had been cleared of its usual furniture, and filled instead with chairs enough for the whole household and half the county's interested parties. Mr. Whitlow the magistrate at a table set with candles, though it was not yet noon, the light through the tall windows still carrying the washed clean quality of a storm just past. Eleanor came in with Fenner at her elbow, and the true bond in a leather case under her arm, and found Julian already standing near the table, and did not need to ask whether he had read the letters, because he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has only just understood he was allowed to want out loud. Gerald stood near the hearth, composed, a folded document of his own held loosely in one hand, and inclined his head to her with a courtesy that had gone brittle at the edges. "Cousin," he said, "I'm glad you've come to see reason after all." "I've come to see the record set straight," she said. "There's a difference, though I understand you've made a career of not noticing it." Whitlow cleared his throat and called the matter to order, and it was Julian who spoke first, quietly, laying the true bond on the table beside Gerald's forged claim, so that the two lay side by side in the candlelight for every person in the room to compare. "My cousin will tell you," Julian said, "that documents can be misread. He said as much to my wife 3 nights ago, as a warning. I'd rather we simply read this one aloud, so that every person in this room hears the same words at the same moment, and no one is left afterward to wonder what was meant by them." He looked once at Eleanor. "A column that balances is the only thing in this world that won't lie to you. My wife's father taught her that. I find, rather late, that I believe it myself." Fenner read the true bond aloud in his old steady voice, the actual sum, the actual date, his own signature as witness beside Edmund Vane's, and then laid the forged ledger page beside it, so the mismatched hand and the impossible flourish under the final numeral stood plain for anyone with eyes to see, and asked, into the room's held breath, whether any man present could account for how 2 documents recording the same debt on the same estate might arrive at sums so different, unless one of them had been made to lie. Gerald's composure held for exactly as long as it took the room to finish murmuring. Then, in the single unguarded movement of the whole affair, he lunged for the forged page on the table, not to examine it, but to snatch it back, to have it in his own hand and nowhere else, and in the lunge the folded document he had been holding fell open against the table's edge, and showed itself, to Whitlow's sharp eye and Fenner's sharper one, to be a second forgery entirely. A fresh claim against the Vane holding drawn up, not 3 weeks before, in preparation for exactly this hearing. "Sit down, Gerald," the dowager said, in a voice Eleanor had never once heard her use, low and final, and something in Gerald's shoulders folded at the sound of it, in a way 3 years of Eleanor's presence in the house had never once managed to produce. He sat. For a moment nothing in his face was charming at all, only tired, and young in a way she had not let herself notice before. And when he spoke again, it came out without any polish left on it whatsoever. "My mother's house is entailed to my uncle's creditors," he said, "to no one and everyone. I have spent 3 years finding some way to keep a roof over her that did not depend on anyone's charity. This was the only ground I could see clear to stand on. I am not sorry it was wrong of me. I am only sorry I was not clever about it." He looked, briefly, almost pleadingly, at Julian. "I never meant vain real harm, only to have something of my own before it was too late to matter." Julian's face did not soften entirely, but something in it eased, the particular mercy of a man who understood desperation without excusing what it had cost. "Your mother's house will be seen to," he said, quietly, and without your name attached to the settling of it. "But you will leave the county by autumn, Gerald, and you will not come near this family's papers again as long as I hold this house." It was not cruelty. It was simply the truth, laid down as plainly as the bonds on the table, and Gerald, to his credit, only nodded, and rose, and bowed once to the room with something almost like his old grace restored to it, and went out, and the room began, slowly, to empty around the 2 documents still lying side by side in the candlelight. They were alone in the long room by the time the last chair had scraped back, and the last low voice faded down the corridor, and Julian crossed to where she stood and set the rosewood box, which she had not seen him carry in, gently on the table between them. "I read them," he said, "all of them. I should have asked your leave first, and I didn't, and I won't pretend otherwise to make it sit easier. I know you read them. I can see it in your face. I never told you about the debt," he said, "because I was afraid that if you knew, you would think yourself paid for rather than chosen, and I could not bear that, so I chose silence instead, and told myself it was mercy. It was cowardice. I see that now, rather too late to spare you 3 years of writing to a man who never once had the courage to write back." His hand went to his wrist, the old gesture, and this time she reached out and stilled it herself, her fingers closing over his, and felt, under her own palm, the small fast evidence of everything he had spent 3 years refusing to show her. "You could have told me at any point," she said, "not to spare me the debt, to spare me the wondering. I know that now. Then I'll tell you what I need instead of wondering it," she said, and felt her father's old steadiness settle into her voice the way it always had over a difficult column. "No more silences kept for my sake without my leave to keep them. Whatever accounts this house holds, I hold jointly, not as a favour lent to me, but as a right I've earned. And Thorn Cottage is signed over outright to my father, in his name alone, so that no one, ever again, holds so much as a shilling's claim over him that isn't his own to answer for." "Done," Julian said, without a heartbeat's pause, and gladly. "And I'd have given you all 3 the day I married you, if I'd had the sense to ask what you wanted, instead of guessing at what would spare you." "Then don't guess again." "No," he said, "I don't intend to." He married her a second time in every way, but law that autumn, a quiet exchange of vows, spoken only between the 2 of them in the estate office, with the chestnut trees outside going gold. And the county never knew there had been 2 ceremonies, only that the Duke and Duchess of Rendale seemed, from that season forward, considerably less like strangers keeping house together, and considerably more like what everyone had assumed. Wrongly, they already were. A year on, the horse chestnuts came into their candle blossom again along the drive, and the gatehouse lantern burned steady each dusk exactly as it always had, and in the estate office at the top of the house, Eleanor sat at her old desk with a fresh sheet before her, dated at the top, in her small exact hand, while across the room Julian read by the fire, with one hand, unthinking now, resting easy and still on the arm of his chair. The rosewood box sat open between them on the table, no longer a thing to be hidden, its lid worn pale at one corner from 3 years of careful closing. She finished the letter, sealed it with the same dented thimble she had worn every day of her marriage, and this time, instead of laying it in the box with the others, she rose and crossed the room and set it, quite simply, into his open hand. "For you to keep," she said, "not to answer, just to have." He looked at it a long moment, and then at her, and said nothing at all, which she had long since learned was, from him, the fullest answer there was. "If this house has kept you company a while tonight, stay by the fire a little longer, because it is the small things this one turns on. A dented thimble, a lantern lit at dusk without fail, a box of letters nobody was ever meant to read. And if it is the letters you are still thinking about, or the moment Fenner finally opened that strong-box, tell me so in the comments, and settle in for the next one while you are there, because there is always another story waiting on this hearth, if you subscribe to Watch Tell Hanel_named you, and let it find you. The kettle is on, another tale is already catching light, so sleep gently tonight, be kind to whoever is closest to you tomorrow, and I will see you by the fire again soon.